In the summer of 1794, the cobblestones of Paris are slick with blood. Outside their window, the guillotine maintains a relentless rhythm. Yet inside this modest home, a family sits calmly around a dining table, sharing a peaceful morning meal. This comfortable household belongs to Maximilien Robespierre. Every morning at 8, while the city outside shudders in fear, a hairdresser meticulously powders the hair of the man who is currently orchestrating the Reign of Terror. Here lies a deeply unsettling historical paradox. The people sharing this table do not see a monster. They adore him. To the Duplay family, Robespierre is a good brother, an absolute paragon of moral virtue. History shows that catastrophic leaders rarely rule by brute force alone. Their longevity relies on a specific psychological architecture, a willing, often fanatical self-deception that followers use to maintain their own sense of safety. Long before he ordered mass executions, the young Robespierre built a reputation as a provincial lawyer, defending the impoverished against the arbitrary justice of the French monarchy. He stood in the pouring rain to deliver orations on behalf of the marginalized. By campaigning for universal male suffrage and the abolition of the slave trade, he earned a moniker that would shield his later actions, the Incorruptible. This initial moral alignment secured a massive deposit of public trust. The psychological defense of a tyrant begins with this foundational investment. Because followers have tied their own identity to the leader's initial ideals, recognizing a pivot towards systemic violence becomes a threat to their own worldview. At the height of the revolution, Robespierre's paranoia fueled the law of suspects. This measure intensified an atmosphere of paralyzing fear, leading neighbors to denounce one another simply to avoid the guillotine themselves. Analytical, this friction illustrates cognitive dissonance, the intolerable mental anguish that occurs when new evidence directly contradicts a deeply held belief. The human brain struggles to hold two conflicting truths without finding a way to resolve the stress. For the Duplay family, admitting that their houseguest was a murderer meant admitting they were complicit. To alleviate that pain, the mind works to rationalize the slaughter. They redefined his mass executions as prompt, severe, inflexible justice, allowing their belief in his virtue to swallow the reality of the terror. The harder a leader behaves, the more intensely followers must defend them. The psychological ego cannot bear the realization that its hero is a monster, so it doubles down on the delusion. In AD 64, a fire destroyed 2/3 of Rome, yet the Emperor Nero remained beloved by the lower classes. He provided tax relief and public entertainment, even personally competing in chariot races to connect with the masses, while the senatorial elite looked on in horror. This chart models terror management theory. When a population is suddenly reminded of its own mortality, its capacity for critical thought collapses. In the face of existential dread, people demand absolute order and a leader who promises to protect them. Nero shielded himself from the fallout of the Great Fire by redirecting public rage toward a marginalized scapegoat, the Christians. By exploiting existing suspicions of this minority sect, he provided the panicked mob with a localized enemy to absorb their anxieties. During a crisis, a terrified society reaches for a ruthless leader to serve as a psychological shield against the void. They trade the complexity of freedom for the soothing illusion of absolute security. By the 19th century, this scale of devotion moved entire armies. Napoleon Bonaparte marched his troops into a catastrophic winter retreat from Russia, decimated the French economy, and was eventually exiled. Yet, upon his return, the nation rallied behind him for one final defeat. They were blinded by the halo effect, a cognitive shortcut where the brain generalizes a single positive trait, like military genius, into an assumption of universal competence. Because Napoleon won at Austerlitz, his followers assumed he was ethically sound and strategically infallible. In the 20th century, totalitarian states industrialized this complicity. Adolf Hitler utilized extreme authoritarianism to bring out the worst in his followers, convincing ordinary citizens to participate in systemic atrocities and the collapse of their own nation. Joseph Stalin maintained power through a pervasive cult of personality that rendered him the indispensable father of the nation. In such environments, individuals suppress their own internal doubts to maintain group harmony, deliberately ignoring obvious red flags to ensure their own survival. A tyrant's power relies on the immense pressure of group cohesion. Eventually, performative loyalty hardens into genuine fanaticism, where the individual's identity is erased and replaced by the group's devotion to the leader. When Robespierre was finally executed, the world he built for his followers collapsed. Maurice Duclé was ruined, and his wife, unable to cope with the destruction of their idol, committed suicide in her prison cell. The eldest daughter, Eleanor, survived, but lived in the shadow of the past. She wore the black garments of mourning for the next 40 years, eternally referring to herself as the widow of the man who had drowned the French Republic in blood. This behavior points toward authoritarian nostalgia. When a tyrant is removed and the following period is marked by economic struggle, populations often forget the atrocities and begin to long for the return of the strongman's decisive cruelty. When a follower's devotion outlives the leader's life and legacy, it suggests that complicity is less about the leader's actual record and more about the psychological security the follower gains from the arrangement. Sudden existential shocks, like the attacks of September 11th, immediately reawaken ancient defensive impulses. Studies proved that subconscious reminders of mortality drastically flip voter support toward aggressive, protective leaders. When participants thought about their own death, preference for strongman rhetoric increased, regardless of actual policies. Modern political figures often leverage this vulnerability. By positioning themselves as the personal embodiment of the nation, they declare that any attack on them is an attack on the people themselves, framing their own survival as the only barrier to societal collapse. Breaking the cycle of tyranny requires the psychological courage to tolerate the discomfort of nuance. We must recognize that the same cognitive gears that sustained the tyrants of history are still turning today, waiting for the next crisis to trade the hard realities of freedom for the lethal illusions of the strongman.